Hello everyone, TLSG here, back again with another daily Marvel Snap video. So today we have a Pool 2 build, and this is going to be on my free-to-play account. I might throw a game in from my full collection log pay-to-play account, because this deck can perform well enough that it can probably still compete with the decks at the highest level. And the beauty of this deck is that it only takes 3 cards from Pool 2. So if you get lucky early on in Pool 2, you should be able to make this deck. Now I'll cover the Pool 2 cards that are in this list a little bit more in depth, some potential alternatives, but the rest should be pretty easy to attain. Now the idea behind this list is that you have Storm. Storm is going to allow you to start working on a control style aspect by locking down a location. And then if you get beaten there, you can always try to push an additional card there with something like your White Tiger, which will push a token into one of your other lanes, even if it is locked down with a flooded location. Or if you do lock down and win that location, you can double down on building power in another lane with something like Gamora or Gamora into Odin, which can create an incredibly powerful effect on the board. And so let's run through each card really quickly. First up we have Iceman. Iceman is going to be phenomenal. Iceman is so very versatile because he adds a lot of disruption to the opponent. As you get further on in the game, a lot of opponent decks will start really curving out well, meaning that they'll have several 2-cost drops, several 3-cost, 4-cost, 5-cost that they want to drop on those particular turns to gain the most value. At certain ranges, a 3-cost is nowhere near as impactful if you drop it on 4. Sometimes a 5-cost that you normally would always drop on turn 5 becomes unusable on turn 6. And so take Professor X for example. It's a 5-cost, 3-power, but you gain the benefit of being able to lock down a lane so that no more power can be played. This is a terrible turn 6 play, and so if Professor X gets hit with Iceman, you disrupt a lot of their power. Now you're not always going to be able to see the effects of Iceman, but I promise it is there. And then next up we have Korg. Korg is probably my second favorite 1-cost card in terms of disruption. It is going to add a rock into your opponent's deck, and when we're talking about only 12 cards per deck, adding one additional disruption factor inside of that deck can cause them to dead draw more often than you realize. By this point, we've all probably experienced Subterranea and how bad it feels to draw 3 rocks at a time, and how bad it feels to draw 3 rocks during a game. Just think of this as a miniaturized Subterranea. You're going to send them that potential disruption, and then when they draw that, if they don't have their priority resources in hand, or if they're still digging through their deck trying to find that ideal combo, that rock could be make or break for their deck. And then next up we have Angela. Angela is going to be a very versatile card. If you're playing anything that kind of swings towards tempo or early game pressure, Angela is phenomenal. Angela is a 2-cost card that as of right now, when you play a card here, you get +2 power onto Angela. And so if you play 3 additional cards in that lane, she's a 2-cost 7 power. If you do something a little bit spicier and you do a Nightcrawler in that lane as well as filling it up, and then you move your Nightcrawler out, it can be a 2-cost 9 power card, which is insane value. It's almost double the power level of the next highest power potential of a 2-cost card. And then we have Scorpion. Scorpion on reveal will afflict the cards in your opponent's hand with -1 power. This adds to that little bit of disruption, and so sometimes a game can come down to 1 or 2 power points. By dropping Scorpion, if you can hit 4 cards, he's offering a 6-power board presence or board value onto the game. If you can hit 5 cards, 7, 6 cards, 8, you guys know math. His impact is phenomenal, and then if you draw into something like Camartage, that will double the effect, and it can get out of hand pretty quickly. And then we have Mr. Fantastic. Mr. Fantastic, as you get further in the game, kind of drops off a little bit, because a 3-cost 6-power card is relatively underwhelming. But in terms of a lockdown list, or this early lockdown list, he's pretty decent. You can drop him in the middle location. He will add 2 power to the left and right lanes. If one of those happens to be locked down with Storm and you just need a little bit of extra power push, he's going to be able to do that for you. And then we have Storm. Storm is one of my favorite cards in the game. She causes the location that she's played at to turn into a flooded lane. A flooded location can only have cards played there for 1 more turn. That means that you have to push all of your last resources there if you want a chance at winning it. And so it's similar to like a kiln if you drop her on curve, where it almost locks down on turn 4. And then we have Enchantress. Early on in Pool 1 and Pool 2 and sometimes Pool 3, you're going to see some really greedy ongoing decks that if you can't address their powers, you're going to lose. And so specifically for pool 2, you're going to see a lot of Devil Dinos. Devil Dinos can be incredibly large, and if they are left alone in a lane, can swing and win the game for the opponent, hands down. With Enchantress, you're going to be able to counter those strong ongoing cards, and so the greedier a deck is and the more ongoings that they stack in a lane, the better value you're going to get from Enchantress. And even if you don't have a particularly good target to play her against, sometimes dropping her on 4, let's say in a stormed location where you only have one additional turn to play those cards, can be worthwhile if you don't have a better alternative choice. And then next up we have Jessica Jones. Jessica Jones used to be a little bit harder to use at 5 cost, but in the most recent balance patch they brought her down to 4 cost, and she feels phenomenal as a 4 cost drop. So the best use for Jessica Jones is that she works so very well with Storm. If you drop Storm and then you follow that up with a Jessica Jones, you're pushing 8 power in that lane because you're not going to be able to play cards in that location that following turn, which will allow you to trigger her own reveal ability of if you don't play a card here next turn, you get plus 4 power. And so an 8 power push on turn 4, if you drop Storm on curve, is huge. It's almost unbeatable, at least at this point in the game. And then you always have the ability to drop Mr. Fantastic or a White Tiger if you need a little bit more push in that Storm lane, but most of the time Jessica Jones will get the job done. And then we have White Tiger. White Tiger is one of our choices for an in-game strategy. White Tiger is going to create a 7 power Tiger token at another location. And so this can be good at reaching hard to reach locations, pushing a little bit of additional power into a stormed lane, or just spreading your power out across the board so that you're not overly invested in one particular lane. Next up we have Gamora. Gamora is phenomenal at the 5 cost slot. By that point in the game, and especially if you locked down a lane with Storm, at that point it comes down to almost a 50-50. And a lot of times you can read the location, read the opponent's kind of play path, and figure out where the opponent is going to drop their card so that you can make this 5 cost 7 power card into a 5 cost 12 power card that can be impacted one more time if you drop Odin to re-trigger her ability. And then next up we have Odin. Odin is going to on reveal activate the on reveal abilities of your other cards at this location. So most of the time we're going to want to use Odin from this list, especially if we had one of our 5 cost kind of in-game strategies. Odin will re-trigger that ability and make his impact even wider. At 8 power, there are alternatives that do beat him in a head versus head power match, but his strength comes from reactivating those 1 or 2 key on-reveal cards in this list. And then finally, we have America Chavez. She is in this list for a couple of reasons. Sometimes we're not going to drop a high-value on-reveal 5 cost drop that we want to Odin, and sometimes that 1 additional power might be make or break. She adds a little bit of consistency to your draws by not being drawn before turn 6. This means you have 1 less option to draw into early, giving you a better chance to draw into your Storm, into your early game combos, your Angela, whenever they really matter. Drawing an Angela on 6 is much less impactful than drawing her on 1 or 2. And so looking at a couple of the pool 2 cards and their alternatives. Now, there's not going to be any replacement for Storm. She offers a very unique ability at limiting the amount of space that your opponents can play in. She makes it into a rush to finish dropping cards and resources in that location, and then making it easier for you to win with something like just a Gamora or just an America Chavez on that final turn. And so in this list, I would say Storm is the one pool 2 card that is absolutely required to run this deck. First up on the somewhat replaceable drops, we have Iceman. Iceman's ability to negatively impact the opponent's curve is unmatched. He's going to be pretty powerful in this list. But if you don't have him and you do want to try your hand at a control style deck, you could replace him with something like a Sunspot from pool 2 if you pull him before Iceman, and so maybe something like a Nightcrawler to re-trigger your Angela to move into the Storm lane if maybe you just lose it just barely and you need a little bit of extra power push. Nightcrawler could do a decent job in sub for the Iceman. And then next up we have Scorpion. Scorpion offers a pretty unique ability in that he impacts the opponent's cards negatively over the course of the next several turns. So this allows you to curve into your Storm on 3, get the most benefit from that location by making it harder for them to win that lane before that lane is even present. But if you don't have Scorpion, we can look at another 2 cost drop, and something like a Lizard can perform fairly well, especially if you know that you're going to drop a Storm, or maybe you do this after you drop Storm. It reduces the likelihood that your opponent is going to drop enough cards to trigger Lizard's negative ongoing ability, reducing his power by 3. And then the final one is not a pull 2 card necessarily, but she does have an alternative that you can use. If you find that you're not anticipating well, that you're not quite getting the reach from Gamora that you would have wanted, you can replace her with a similar card of Spider-Woman. Spider-Woman is going to be a 5 cost 7 power card, which is in line with Gamora if you don't trigger that on reveal ability, but Spider-Woman's ability is a little easier to hit more consistently. For Spider-Woman, at the 5 cost slot, her on reveal is going to afflict all enemy cards here with -1 power. So similar to a Scorpion, only she impacts that lane immediately. And so if you need a little bit of power push and you're trying to compete for a lane that your opponent has quite a few resources in, Spider-Woman could be a good replacement for Gamora, but personally I like the consistency of Gamora. If you lock down a lane, you can pretty easily guess or assume where your opponent's going to drop cards, and then if they don't and you follow that up with an Odin but you won the Storm lane, you're pretty much unbeatable in that lane. That being said, Spider-Woman is a little bit more flexible, a little easier to use. So for games that you don't drop Storm, or maybe you get a bad read, Spider-Woman is going to be a decent tech for you. But that is the rundown of the deck list. We are going to go ahead and jump to a couple of games. I hope you guys enjoy. Alright, so first up we have Toeller. In our starting hand, we don't have anything to play, so we're going to go ahead and jump over into turn 2, where we can drop our Angela. Angela is going to be phenomenal to drop. Angela, we can then start stacking our other cards, giving us a pretty good chance to win that lane. Okay, so they drop Invisible Woman, which is going to be interesting. Invisible Woman pretty much protects any of the ongoing cards behind it from being Enchantress. We're not going to be able to dispel the ongoing abilities of whatever's behind her, so it kind of acts as a little bit of protection at the cost of being kind of forced into a little bit lower power level in that lane. But if the impact is high enough, then it doesn't necessarily matter that she's only a 2 power drop. And so this turn we're going to drop our Iceman and our Korg onto the Angela lane. That's going to offer them a little bit of disruption. Maybe we can stop them from drawing into their on reveal abilities that, or whatever they're wanting to hide behind Invisible Woman. Maybe we can push and win Baxter Building by just enough power to... Okay, so they end up storming it, which is, I mean, it plays into our game plan pretty well. Unless they have something that can push power wide over the long extent of the game, it works pretty well in our favor. I think we follow this up. I think we follow this lane up and we go ahead and drop Enchantress. I think we avoid the Invisible Woman. A lot of times you don't get the value unless you know for sure what they're running behind Invisible Woman, but in this scenario we don't. And so they drop a Debris, which is kind of interesting. They have a couple of pool 3 cards. The Debris, I'm not sure what purpose it's going to serve unless they have maybe a Patriot, but that's not going to help them in the flooded lane. And so now all we have to do is worry about winning one of these other locations. And I think our location of choice is going to be Wakanda Embassy. We're going to drop Gamora there. If they do have ongoing abilities, or if they're trying to push and win this lane, most of the time they want to make use of the Invisible Woman. They will invest some resources there. So let's go ahead and drop our Gamora. I think we should be able to trigger... Oh, we got the read wrong. So this is one of those scenarios where a Spider-Woman would be maybe a little bit better, but that's okay. And then we draw into our Chavez on the final turn, which is going to be a decent power push. And I think we go with stacking into this lane. I don't see any way that they push enough power into the flooded lane to win. But we really just need to stack our power into this other lane, unless we thought they had a way to counter it. We only need to stack our power into the other lane so that we win that one. We can abandon Isle of Silence. And actually, I didn't catch it before, but Isle of Silence is going to disable any ongoing effects that are there. And they dropped Blue Marvel. Blue Marvel is really only useful for his ongoing ability, which is your other cards have +1 power. But he doesn't get that in Isle of Silence. I think it was a slight misplay on Todd's end. Let's go ahead and drop our Chavez. That should be enough to swing this location. They do have an Ultron, which is interesting. Had they dropped Blue Marvel here, it would have given these a +1 power each. So a +4 power total in each of the lanes, but it wouldn't have been enough to swing this location in their favor. It might have been enough to swing Wakanda Embassy in their favor though. So Blue Marvel here would have bumped them up to 15, and then 16, 17, 18. We would have tied in this lane, and it would have came down to a tiebreaker. And at that point, it would have been really, really close of who would win. So the misplay of Blue Marvel definitely helped us out. I don't know that it was the make or break for this game, but even though we didn't draw Storm, they helped us with the Storm drop, and just overall, we had a pretty decent power push and a pretty good start for the deck. Let's go ahead and jump over into the next one and see if we can keep it going. Alright, so next up we have RYTY. The first location is Baxter Building again, which gives us a little bit of deja vu from the last game. The second location is Sinister London, which can get pretty crazy pretty quickly, but I oftentimes don't necessarily care for duplicating our Angela, because if we're planning on using the Sinister London to its full effect, Angela here would get buffed up, but the other one would remain around a 1 power range unless we drop a card there physically in that lane, which most of the time you want to curve your cards into Sinister London so you can get the most impact out of them. So we're actually going to drop Scorpion over the Angela play here. That's going to negatively impact all of their cards in their hand by 2. So we're getting an 8 power negative. We're negating their power level by 8 in their current hand, and we drop 4 power on the board, which is a pretty good kind of trade-off. And so they sent us a Black Widow. Black Widow is a pool 3 card that on reveal add a Widow's Bite to your opponent's hand. So with this account, we are a little bit into pool 3, and so we do face some of these matches. You guys may not face necessarily these hard of matches, but even in pool 3, this deck list is still viable. And so here, I think we double down on our Widow's Bites, and then we can do a Mr. Fantastic, which will double down somewhere. Ideally, we're gonna we want to win Baxter Building pretty heavily. No. So I'm actually going to lean towards pushing power over into Baxter Building, or I guess the Widow's Bites, not the power, into Baxter Building. And the reason for that is I want to be able to use our Gamora in a way that it forces her to go into Camartage. And so then if it triggers here, and then it happens to re-trigger here, or if we go with the Odin path, that makes these 2 lanes almost impossible to beat. And so we do cap out the Baxter Building location. They go with a Carnage to clear up their lanes a little bit. But that's okay. If they hit us with the debris that's pretty tough, they could end up destroying this location altogether. And so because of that, since we turn first, I think we potentially protect ourselves from a double debris on reveal in this location. And so if it was a double, it would cap this location out. If it's only 1 trigger, then our Gamora can still be played here next turn, bounce over here, and then we can drop an Odin into this lane naturally. And so let's see what they end up dropping. If it's a debris, then the storm play is actually pretty nice. Oh, nope, so it's an Ironheart, which they were going for the double trigger, but we are able to counter the double trigger of Ironheart. We still get some upside from the interaction. So let's go with the Gamora. That's going to go here and here. So whichever lane they play in, it will get buffed up. If they happen to play into both, that's perfect, because now it's going to buff up in Sinister London. That 12 power Gamora is going to copy into the Flood lane and boost up again into a 17 power presence, which is nuts. 17 power on 1 card is absolutely insane. And so now we know that we're going to draw into our America Chavez for the final turn to give ourselves a pretty good push in Sinister London, or a further push in Sinister London, and another push over in the flooded lane. And so with Gamora, the power of Gamora is that she can really force the opponent's hand pretty quickly if you're able to make sure that she triggers. And so in this case, 24 power in this lane is almost impossible to beat. If they had a Shang-Chi and you start running into Shang-Chi, you have to get a little more cautious about playing high power cards. But otherwise, Gamora is going to swing a lot of games in your favor. Let's go ahead and jump over into the next one. All right, so next up we have Mr. Anderson. And if you guys want to see the true potential and reach of this deck, Mr. Anderson is someone that I match up with pretty frequently on my main account, my full collection log, infinite ranked main account. And so Mr. Anderson should be a pretty good gauge of how impactful and how effective the deck can be all across the different pools. And so if we can find a win condition against a pool 3 veteran or a deep pool 3 player, I'm certain that you could find a way to win in most scenarios in a pool 2 versus match. And so let's go ahead and drop our Scorpion into Wakanda, and cards can't be destroyed here. Scorpion's not one that we necessarily ever have to worry about being destroyed, but we are going to play it here until we see what this last location is. And so they used Blade and it discarded a Ghost Rider. So that typically means they're running a Hela deck list, which you won't have to worry about until you get deeper into pool 3. But it is something that we need to be mindful of as far as how much power they can push on that final turn. So let's go ahead and push Mr. Fantastic in mid. I know that we could get a 4 power into the lane to the right if we put him into Onslaught Citadel, but pushing power into multiple lanes seems a little bit better for us in this scenario. Now, they did use Lady Sif and it discarded their Hela. That takes away a large majority of their power push with this deck. And so with that kind of knowledge or information, I think we're going to go ahead and storm the Citadel lane. It doesn't do us much good overall to storm. Actually, instead of storming, we're going to go ahead and just do a Jessica Jones into Onslaught Citadel. We'll let that rest, let it buff up next turn. We might end up dropping a White Tiger in Dark Dimension, and then if we draw into our Odin next, then we can do White Tiger into an Odin, and on that final turn, once it does reveal, it will push these out into, it'll push the White Tiger tokens out onto the rest of the board. Okay, and so we get Gamora here. So we could use Gamora as a way to try to push additional power into one of these lanes, but I don't know. White Tiger is a safer play, because we don't know, with this setup, I don't know for sure where they're going to play. If I had to guess, I would say in Wakanda, but I don't know that for sure. That's just a gut read, because that's where they have the most space. They could also very likely drop it into Dark Dimension, but we don't know that for sure either. And so it does look like they pushed over into the far left, interestingly enough. And so they're running an Agatha Hela deck list. And so right now in this lane, they have the win, and they have a pretty good chance at, having a pretty high impact final turn play. Luckily, they ended up retreating. They, I guess, didn't have maybe a good power push for that final turn. They didn't have a way to push a lot of power across the board. White Tiger was going to potentially swing this location for us. We didn't have an Odin to re-trigger, so maybe we ended up going something like a Gamora and an Iceman. In Wakanda, that would have forced our Tiger token to go here, giving us a better chance to win this location, but we don't know for sure. We don't get to see it play out, but that's the couple of thoughts that I had in mind, at least at the current time. All right, and so next up we have Mellow Lemons, and this is another one that I run into on my main account quite a bit. And so while you might not run into some of these cards or some of these combos this early on, it does give a pretty good idea of what the potential power push of this deck is across the different pools. And so let's go with an Iceman and Stark Tower. That's going to give us a +2 power bonus to any cards that we have there on after turn 5, but we might not keep that power pressure. We may look to stack it. Maybe we change it with Storm if it looks like they're going to outpace us there. We have a couple options, and so we can do Scorpion. That's going to impact all of their cards negatively. Mojo is one that we need to be careful about, because it is going to positively impact this lane quite a bit. I think we go ahead and, seeing the Sanctum Sanctorum, I think we go ahead and snap. We have a couple of ways to push power into that lane that the opponent might not. We have Mr. Fantastic, who's going to push power sideways into that lane. We have White Tiger that can potentially summon a Tiger token in that direction. And so we have a couple of options that we can lean into. And so let's go ahead and lock in our Mr. Fantastic. They do a Cosmo, so we're not going to be able to do our White Tiger there anymore. We're not going to be able to do like a Jessica Jones that kind of kneecaps us pretty heavily. So I think what we do is let's just go with an Enchantress. Enchantress is going to cancel out the Mojo ability, which Mojo, if both players have 4 cards at that location, it's going to gain +6 power. So this makes it really hard for you to cap it out strategically, because it's going to lose you 6 power to put that last card in that slot. So it has to be a really good card, unless you cancel out the ability with something like Enchantress. So let's go ahead and lock in the Enchantress. And then we can look at maybe doing a White Tiger. Maybe we look at filling this location up this turn. I don't know. We'll have to play it by ear. They do have a Warpath, which is a pretty potent. It's a pretty potent threat. We could do a Gamora if we think that they're going to cap this one out this turn. They could also be running something like a Spectrum. If so, then they leave this last space free to drop Spectrum on that final turn. And if that's the case, then this lane becomes pretty easy to overcome, I think. So let's go with a Gamora into Nova Roma. We will probably end up going with an America Chavez into the Stark Tower lane. If I was a betting person, I bet they play something here this turn, and then on the final turn they drop like a Spectrum here, because they can no longer drop Spectrum into the middle to have the on reveal trigger. I should not be a betting person, because we end up losing the Stark Tower currently. I think 9 power will be enough to swing the location in our favor. It's not. 9 power is not going to be enough. That one's tough. So between Captain America, the Stark Tower bonus, they actually beat us in Stark Tower. So even if we do a 9 power drop here, that only puts us to 25. our really only win condition or best bet is to stack this lane in a way that they can't overcome it. And so I think 18 power is going to be pretty formidable. I think it's going to be hard for them to overcome any kind of ability that would cancel out ours or push power sideways is going to be negated because of the Cosmo. They could drop, oh no, they could drop a destroyer in this lane and it's not going to trigger. So that's 18 power. So we tie here, we lose this one. So they have a destroyer. They're going to drop destroyer here. It's not going to trigger because of Cosmo. So it's going to put them at 18 power. And even though we also have 18 power, it's not going to matter. It's so close, but so far away. We can't do something like an Odin to re-trigger Gamora because of Cosmo. And so it's, ooh, the destroyer. The Scorpion saved us. The Scorpion from, what, turn 2? Hit their destroyer, reduced his power by 1. That 1 was enough to break the tiebreaker in our favor in Nova Roma, allowing us to sneak Sanctum Sanctorum with just the Mr. Fantastic bonus. What a tough win, but definitely a satisfying win.